All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Good afternoon. As Managing Director of the Hudson Valley Writers Center, I'm so happy to welcome you to this very special reading with poet Suzanne Cleary, which has been brought to you today by Chelsea Senior Living on Dobbs Ferry Road in Greenburgh. We're so happy to be partnering with the Chelsea, which is a brand new community with apartments available for assisted living and also for memory care. More info can be found at chelseaseniorliving.com. And I want to thank Suzanne Steffens at the Chelsea for all of her work helping to make this event possible. Here at the Hudson Valley Writers Center, we bring writers and readers together to celebrate the essential art of the written word. And our home is in Sleepy Hollow, New York, but for the last year and a half, we've been celebrating this essential art together here on Zoom. We host writing workshops, an ongoing reading series, we publish poetry through Slapring Hole Press, and we offer outreach programs for community members. I want to thank our founder, Margot Taft-Stever, whose vision and hard work are responsible for the center now embarking on its 31st year. I want to also thank our generous supporters, both individual and institutional, especially NISCA and Arts Westchester, who support us and make our work possible. We are delighted to have poet Suzanne Cleary joining us today to read for us some of her work. After the reading, you will all have the chance to send some questions through the chat function in an open Q&A for Suzanne. Suzanne Cleary's Crude Angel, Bookmark Press 2018, is her fourth full-length poetry collection. Beauty Mark, Bookmark 2013, won the John Ciardi Prize for Poetry, the Nassar Poetry Prize, and the Patterson Award for Literary Excellence. Recipient of a Pushcart Prize and the Cecil Hemley Memorial Award of the Poetry Society of America, she's enjoyed residencies at Yaddo and MacDowell. Her poems appear in national and international journals, most recently in The Moth, as one of 4 finalists chosen by Nick Laird for the annual Moth Poetry Prize. She teaches as core faculty in the MFA in Creative Writing program of Converse College and is completing her 5th book. Her website, which we'll put in the chat in just a moment, is www.suzanneclearypoet.com. Suzanne, thank you so much for joining us today. And with that, I'll hand it over to you to share with us some of your work.
Okay, thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Jessie. I also thank the Chelsea for this opportunity to read. And as always, the Hudson Valley Writers Center and Margot Taft-Stever, who I see is here today. I also see other friends of mine from far away are in the Zoomosphere with us. That is so exciting. So I thank you and I thank everyone who's listening today. I feel that I've been doing a lot of poetry readings over the past few months. So today I'm reading poems that I usually don't read. And I'm also reading them with my upcoming poetry workshop in mind. And I will admit to you, when I first read the description for my poetry workshop and I saw the word whimsy, I was a little worried. I thought, wait, whimsy doesn't sound very serious. It sounds maybe even silly. And then I realized that actually whimsy is play. And I believe that playfulness is just crucial to all creativity. So I'm actually very happy now with that word whimsy and certainly with play. This first poem that I'm going to read is kind of a playful poem, I guess. It's about a word that I always heard a lot when I was growing up in Binghamton, New York. Kind of a silly word, actually. You may know it, the word cahoots. The poem is called Cahoots. I figured it was somewhere up near Albany, maybe a suburb where the governor lived. But what did I know? I was a kid, I didn't drive, and how far can you pedal on a banana-style seat with playing cards clothespin to the back wheel? Every week, someone else was in cahoots, had traveled to that famous town. I wondered, what was the draw of cahoots for the mechanics who charged my father twice for the wipers on our lime-kissed green station wagon? What was the draw for the freckled twins who smashed our pumpkin, for the blue-haired sisters who cheated at church bingo? This much I knew. In Cahoots, people played bingo, although I could not say if there were churches up there. And I knew this: no one was ever alone. There were always at least two in Cahoots. No one who had seen it ever spoke of it. The stories of Cahoots were left for others to tell, my grandfather especially, who knew of more people in Cahoots than did anyone else for miles. He named names. He named neighborhoods where, for example, no one would speak Slovak to him, where Slovaks would not speak their own language. They're all in cahoots, he would say, in a tone that suggested overcrowding, a place I would not want to live or even to visit. Better to stay there in Binghamton with my mother and father in our modest but pleasant split level. Never fond of travel, each July we inexplicably packed the wagon for our week at the Jersey Shore. One year, a horseshoe crab, like a crusty hubcap laced with green slime, washed onto the sand. My father and two boys slipped driftwood under the crab, nudged it onto the lip of rising tide, which lifted it, carried it beyond sight. Already I knew that somehow the waves and the moon were in cahoots. I knew that each day was shorter than the day before. If that summer I suspected that Cahoots was not a place, I was wrong. Too young to know that we all end up in Cahoots, whether to visit the outskirts or to settle in Cahoots Heights or Greater Cahoots. I was still so young that I'd have sworn, cross my heart, I would never be in Cahoots. Not ever. Not me. In my poetry workshop at the Hudson Valley Writers Center, we'll probably write some poems based on memory, because memory is a great place to go for poetry ideas. If something has stuck in your head, by definition, it's important to you on some level. So memory can provide us with great material. This next poem is also a poem that is based on a memory, and it's based on Binghamton. This is not a childhood memory. This is several decades later. And the poem is called Reunion. By the time of your 40th high school reunion, there are old people who are younger than you are. And you understand that soon you always will walk at the pace of this group tour of your alma mater, or mine, where 15 of us take turns staring into the locked chemistry lab and ducking into the cafeteria. Our guide is an honors student who gets extra credit for leading us on this bright Saturday afternoon, who maneuvers us up the short staircase into East Hall, where she pauses, perhaps so that we can catch our breath, perhaps to command our full attention as she reminds us of the location of tonight's dinner downtown. We are, I see, within sight of the room where I fell in love with poetry, senior year, last semester, a class I took purely because it fit into my schedule. Is there time enough to see that room? I ask and I receive. Our guide steps politely to the side as she opens the door. The room is predictably smaller, and yet smaller still, divided into two by a new wall, which has stood there probably for decades. There is a door in that wall, open to a room that was part of the original room, but I enter neither. No one, I notice, feels the need to enter. A moment of awkwardness I choose to find beautiful. From the doorway, I can see where I sat as Mr. Lasowski opened Robert Bly's Silence in the Snowy Fields. For what would be the last time in my entire long life I would begin listening to a poem without half holding my breath so as better to hear. The edge of the deep blue book rested lightly on the table as the walls of the room dissolved, I guess, for I saw the walls reassemble as the end of class bell rang. There they were, the pale blue walls, and the possibility that this color is like eggs in a nest or like my grandmother's hair. There was now another room inside of that room, and inside of everything that I could ever see. It's a lot of fun to write poems about things that I see or that I hear or that I read. I feel that there is material for poetry all over the place if I'll just keep my eyes open. And I especially like to write poems about stories that I've heard. And this story was told at a poetry reading given by the poet Yehashua November. And I liked his poetry very much, but I often loved the stories that he used to introduce his poems. And this poem that I wrote is based on one of his stories. The poem is for Yehashua November, and the poem is called Baseball. Even when young, he could not hit and could not field. It was against his nature to throw a ball at a man. But 70 years old, finally he discovers his place in the great American pastime. As his wife scolds, then cautions, "Do you know how old you are?" He lowers himself onto the floor to sit cross-legged with his grandsons, baseball cards spread in an arc before them. For the younger boy, he reads each player's name card by card. For the older boy, he listens, widening his eyes and nodding as the boy recites statistics, explains elaborate permutations of elaborate rules. And when the boys ask him, then beg him, he takes a single card. He holds it close, then far. He stares into the athlete's young eyes, set in a face aged prematurely by sun. Then, very slowly, in keeping with the game of baseball, he takes the pen from his jacket, writes the player's name across the corner of the card, as if it is the man's autograph. Note, this man is not Mantle nor DiMaggio. Their cards framed and hung on a baseball wall, on the bedroom wall. This man is one of the rookies, or the mid-career of middling career. A new card still smelling of fresh cardboard, of stale bubble gum. In the slanting light before prayers, before dinner, methodically, he signs each card the boys hand to him, until the boys grow tired of the game of baseball, preferring their grandfather's knowledge of the inner life of baseball. Stories beginning, "This man writes big because his eyes are weak from staring too long at the sun." Or, "This man writes tiny so that he can sign his name many times before his pen runs out of ink." Now, I'm going to read two more poems, and this next poem I have never read anywhere, and I've decided to read it today because it's a kind of a playful poem. I thought it might be fun to read, and it's about the fact that somewhere along the way, I got the idea that on the planet Jupiter, we weigh I think it's 9 times as much as we weigh on Earth. I think I learned that when I was a child, and I just grasped that fact. And although I have since learned that this is not true, and actually Jupiter's been in the news a lot. If you read the science news like this week, this is not true about Jupiter. We don't weigh 9 times our own weight up there, but I still believe it. I still believe it. And I think on some level, maybe this very kind of silly poem is perhaps about the difficulty that we have of accepting that some of our beliefs are just wrong. They've been disproven, but still we can't let go of what we think is true. So at any rate, this is my poem called Jupiter. My God, for 50 years I have believed that on Jupiter I would weigh 9 times what I weigh on Earth, and it is too late for me to change. 50 years is too long to believe, then not, in a notion of my arms, each the weight of a piano, of my legs, each the weight of a sofa bed rented with the apartment because no one can lift it. No one can slide it to the window, lower it on ropes to the street. 50 years is too long to believe, then not. To abandon the notion of my body, the weight of a rowboat sinking into the lake where I learned to swim. The boat taking on the weight of that water encircled with blue trees, encircled with my family in little cabins. 50 years is too long to erase the image of the doctor's scale on Jupiter, 9 times its normal size so as to accommodate the weight I would carry, although that weight is invisible on Jupiter just as it is on Earth. These days when my arms are each as heavy as the bargain Steinway we gave to our neighbors, more musical than we, although no more happy, no more given to dance. At the first wedding I saw, old couples polkaed in flowered dresses and Sunday suits, their feet suddenly small, it seemed, beneath them, as if the feet of children carried them across the floor in wide arcs, like light on the surface of a lake. There are no lakes on Jupiter, far as I know, and no wooden cabins beside them. But everything on Jupiter weighs 9 times its weight on Earth. At weddings, when the band leader lifts his accordion and adjusts the strap across his shiny maroon necktie, everyone on the Jupiter dance floor stands still, watching him spread his fingers above the keys. My God, it is too late for me to stop believing in the weight of that accordion, transferred to the strap on his shoulder and distributed across his chest and into his legs, so his arms and fingers can move lightly as fireflies in that dark and distant world. And the poem that I'm going to end with today is a poem that I have read a few times recently. This, a lot of people wonder where you get ideas for poems. Poets wonder that, by the way, all the time. Where do we get ideas for our poems? And my best answer to that is everywhere. But that's not a very satisfying answer, is it? We get poems everywhere. So I would put a finer point on that by saying that we get ideas from what we see and what we hear, what we read, and what sticks with us. What kind of bothers us or works on us the way, if you listen to the radio and a song comes on and then after you can't get that song out of your mind, that feeling is what it feels like to feel a poem coming on. There's something that's just kind of hanging around. And for me, I like to take that and think about it on paper. And that's really what happened with this next poem that I'm about to read. A former student of mine, and a former MFA student of mine, who's now a good friend of mine, sent me an email back in the early days of quarantine. And his email conjured such a vivid image in my mind that I thought, well, let me just see what will happen. Maybe I'll write a poem. And that image was just that bright light inside the CVS pharmacy. You know, and we all know that light. And I apologize for, planting that image in your head, but it stayed with me. So that's where this poem began. And this poem is addressed to my student, and it's for my student, Russell Jackson. And the poem is called "For the Poet Who Writes to Me While Standing in Line at CVS, Waiting for His Mother's Prescription." It's nothing that you flat out say, Russell, but your email reminds me that 6 months into pandemic, 5 months into quarantine, CVS remains open 24 hours. Its harsh blue-white light steady, as nothing in nature is steady. Those long fluorescent bulbs still dive-bombing lumens so that midnight is bright as 8 a.m. or 4 a.m. or 2 p.m. or 7:30 p.m. You can see that I struggle to carry one thought to the next these long days. I spend hours on the internet, becoming expert on the height of actors from Hollywood's golden age, on the 25 cutest photos of 4-year-old Princess Charlotte. I now know that the poet Elizabeth Bishop was a bit taller than I am, a bit heavier. Her clothes would be too big for me, as no doubt her shoes. Russell, what is it that supposedly concentrates the mind wonderfully? Samuel Johnson said it in Boswell's biography, which I have never read and never will. I know my limits. Lately, I think that I know little else worth knowing. My only advice for your poems, Russell: wash your hands for as long as it takes to sing Happy Birthday. Did you know that song's no longer copyrighted? 5 years ago, U.S. District Court Judge George H. King ruled Happy Birthday is public domain. The 1935 patent applied only to the melody and specific arrangements of the tune, but not to the actual song itself. When Judge King writes actual song, he means lyrics. But I hear him saying song is something beyond the reach of law, beyond reach of language. Song is like a kernel of light inside of things, steady. Russell, be like CVS. I don't know what this means, be like CVS. Russell, dare to say what doesn't make sense, then wait patiently to see the sense inside of it. Be like CVS. Be like the bewildering variety of toothpastes, decongestants, hair conditioners. Be like orange Velcro knee braces, like spools of pastel ribbon that hums, pulled across a scissor. Be like the aisle of bare shelves where the cleaning products stood, where the white metal shelves now display only how each shelf, with a simple, ingenious hook, fits into the frame. I'm telling you nothing that you don't already know, Russell. Be like whatever accepts the horrid light and shines in it. Be like the 8-ounce can of lightly salted cashews for which you are newly willing to pay $12.99 as you stand in line waiting for the blue-gloved hands to hold out to you the small white bag, which is not for you, except in that you are the one who will carry it where it must go.
Thank you, Suzanne. It was so wonderful to hear such rooted imagery that puts you exactly in a space and time. So at this point, we're going to open it up to questions. If anyone has any questions for Suzanne, you can send them over to me in the chat and I'll help moderate and get those to her. And to start us off on our questions, Suzanne, you talked a lot about what inspires your writing and where the initial spark for your poems can come. And the answer really does sound like everywhere. And most of what you shared today was rooted in a specific memory or moment or person. Is there ever a time when you're writing where the spark is more imaginative and comes just out of the blue without a physical or literal starting point?
I think sometimes a poem will start with a phrase that I've heard, and that phrase is kind of disembodied, as it were. It isn't really located in a specific place, but I like the sound of the words, or maybe the sound suggests a story to me. I always hope that my poems are not rooted in my own life or my own experience particularly. I love to think that the world feeds me poems, and I tend to think of a poet as a vessel for what the world gives to them, rather than someone who's sort of pouring their insides out. Did that make sense?
It does. And that actually leads me to another question about narrator and narration style. Is there a specific point of view that you like to write from, even if it's not necessarily your life? Do you like first person, third person? Do you like to switch it up? Do you feel drawn to a certain type of narration?
Yeah, that's a great question. I tend to write poems that use the word I quite a lot, first person narration, but quite often that I is not me. I will speak for someone else, a character in history or someone who has an interesting story. I kind of suspect that their voices sound like me a little bit, but I try to make them sound like themselves, maybe by using a vocabulary that I wouldn't normally use or wouldn't automatically use. But I would like to think that there's an elasticity to the narration in my work, and it's certainly usually not me. And even if it is me, there is that statement out there, or that debate, that when we use the word I, that is very much a crafted I. We're really shaping our reader's notion of ourselves. So if I'm writing from my own viewpoint, I'm only telling you what you want to know, and I may also be lying. It's okay to lie in poetry. I recommend it, actually.
We've got a question that is apropos of how we're gathering today. Of course, we're gathering on Zoom, like so many things these days. And this is a question about your process a little more logistically. How do you like to write? Do you use pen and paper? Are you on a typewriter? Do you rely upon technology when you write? Combination of the three?
Oh, here's the wonder of Zoom for you. This is where the magic happens, or not. I do write. I write by hand.
Nice.
And then when it becomes just too illegible, then I turn to my computer and I type out versions of the poem. My husband will tell you that I often also write on paper that is, say, a corner of the newspaper or in a margin of an article in the New Yorker. And then I tear off the edge of the page and I destroy the article. I have Post-it notes all over the place. So I think I prefer to write by hand because that's slower than typing. And when you type something, it does tend to look pretty good. Like, wow, that looks like a poem. And wow, I can make, stanzas just like that. But that's deceptive. Better that the words remain in a kind of a state of limbo, percolating in the notebook by hand. And then only when I feel the poem has developed to a certain point do I turn to the computer.
When did you come to poetry, Suzanne? Have you been writing poetry since you were a girl? Did you come to it later in life? Tell us about how you found your way to this art form.
Yeah, when I was very small, say in elementary school, I hated poetry, or I thought I hated poetry, because it always seemed to me that when we read it in school, there was some kind of secret inside of it. The teacher wanted us to decode what was happening, and I couldn't do that readily. And I was a good student, if I do say so, but I loved joke books. I loved riddle books. In fact, that was all I really wanted to read when I was, say, anywhere from like 7 to 10. And I look back now and I see that riddles, especially, are wordplay. They are entirely wordplay. And I was taken by that immensely. I did not like poetry at all, however, until I was in high school. And I happened to take a poetry workshop my last semester. I actually mentioned that in one of the poems I read today. And I just happened into that workshop. And when I was there, I had a teacher who didn't have us reading John Keats, who is, by the way, one of my very favorite poets, now. He didn't have us read Keats, but he had us read contemporary poets who were using language somewhat the way I would use language. And I absolutely fell head over heels in love with this idea that words could make me pay attention in a very serious and fun way to what was around me. I just suddenly felt that words kind of activated the life around me. It became more vivid. And that's how I fell in love with poetry. But I'm definitely not someone who would say to you, oh, yes, I've always written poems, as many of my students do, by the way. Many, many people have always written poetry. And that's not me. I always colored and sewed. I always told jokes.
Great. We've got two questions that I would say feed into each other. So I'll start with Meryl's question, which is, how do your poems find their form? As you work on it, do you change your mind many times about how it will sit on the page? Are you rearranging things? Or do you usually start with a sense of the shape of the poem and the music of it from the start?
That's a great question from a great poet, Meryl. Thank you so much for being here. Form is something that is so crucial to me when I'm in the final stages of writing a poem. Maybe I'm 75% of the way through with my poem and I want to shape it on the page. While I'm working on a poem, I'm actually very wary of trying to fit it into a form or into a shape. I don't usually write in form. I do love the sonnet form. And lately I've been really drawn to the pantoum, although I've not been having a lot of luck with it. But I tend to write in a free verse form. And so for me, I would say the main shaping element or formal element is the stanza. And when I'm working on a poem that's nearing its late stages, then I'm definitely on the computer and I'm definitely experimenting with stanza breaks. And I love tercets. So if I've got a long run of words, a long column of words, I'll just, go through and hit the return to make tercets. And what I find happens for me is when I add in those breaks, my focus intensifies on certain, segments of the poem, and then I'll see things that I didn't see otherwise for maybe developing a poem or maybe deleting. And then I'll go back and I'll get rid of the tercets and I'll try maybe in couplets or somewhere else. But for me, I'm always a bit wary of imposing a form or a stanzaic form on the poem until the poem is developed, because I find that this is bringing another part of my brain into the process, a kind of a very analytical shape making part of my brain. And I want to stay in just that sort of mush, that creative mush where I don't know what's happening and I'm just anything goes and I'm experimenting. Then later on, I have to say, okay, come on, let's try to package this. And it is packaging. I mean, I've used that word. I'm not really happy to use it, but you're kind of at the end, you are packaging your poem for its maximum impact on a reader.
Mm. That's a perfect segue to Sandra's question, which is, how do you decide when poems are ready to visit the world, either for a reading or a publication? Thinking back to the poem Jupiter you shared, you said that was the first time that you had read it for us, or for anyone. Is it a newer poem, or how did you come to determine it was ready to loose them into the world?
You know, it's actually a rather old poem, and I'm now in the process of working on a new book. And part of that process is looking back through my poetry files, electronic and paper, to see what poems never made it into a book, or, you know, for whatever reason, they kind of fell by the wayside. They didn't feel as though they were part of another project. And I found Jupiter, and I actually sent Jupiter to one of my poetry friends who said, "Gee, this is really a fun poem, Suzanne. I got a kick out of it." And so I then turned to it, and kind of gave it another serious look. But it's much more common for me to, when I think I have a poem that's just about done, to stand up right here in this study and walk next door to my husband's study, because my husband is a very smart man who's a very great lover of poetry. He loved poetry before he loved me, he always says. And he's my first reader, and I don't by any means always, agree with what he tells me or do what he thinks I should do with a poem, but he's a great first reader, and I send my poem out to other dear friends of mine who are poets or are not, and I see what they think about what I'm doing, because I find that I don't always know what works. I tend to think my poems work better than they do because of this very understandable situation, which is that they've come from my own head. Of course, I understand what this poem is doing. And that really is the beauty of being in a poetry workshop, right there, right in a nutshell. Each of us, regardless of how long we've been writing poetry or how long we've been reading poetry, we are in a position where we cannot read through someone else's eyes. And that's why you need the workshop, which is a group of interested readers as much as a group of writers. So I'm a great fan of sharing my work with others before I share it with a group. And the reason I decided to share it today in this reading, the poem Jupiter, is that I thought, well, let's just see. It's an experiment. I always say that when, to my students in particular, when we're writing, we are on an adventure, really. We're trying to explore ideas. I mean, that's what I'm doing when I'm writing a poem, is I am essentially exploring ideas on paper. There's something I want to think about, and one of the best ways for me to think is to put a pen in my hand, a nice juicy Uniball pen in my hand, and then just put my thoughts out on paper. It's externalized thought. I move the words around, and there's a poem. And I feel that I felt that it would be, an adventure to just read Jupiter and see how it went.
Well, I'm glad you did. We've got time for just one more question. And thank you again, Suzanne, for spending so much wonderful time explaining and giving us insights into your process. So it sounds like, your craft tends to vary and is on a bit of a forever evolving spectrum. From a zoomed out view, though, has the craft of writing poetry itself, whether in the academic world or your own craft, has it changed since you first began writing? And if so, how? Are there specific changes you see happening in the world of poetry?
Right. It's kind of shocking for me to realize that I have been writing poetry for probably 50 years. I mean, almost, right? And so that's a long time. And I think poetry has changed, it has developed, it's gotten more exciting in a lot of ways over these past decades. I think probably one of the biggest changes is that now we have a whole world really of poetry that is poetry written for performance. It's written to be spoken rather than to be read on the page or solely read on the page. And I think that's really exciting because I think it connects poetry back to its origin as music, as an oral art, first of all. I think that's brought a lot of energy into poetry. I think it has also enabled some of us who don't write a so-called spoken poetry or spoken word poetry to dare to be more animated in what we do in our work. I find that a lot of poetry that's being written today, I love, and I feel that it's brand new. I have no interest in necessarily writing it, but you never know. And one of the things that I always tell my students, especially my MFA students, is that, if you're going to be a serious poet, you have to be seriously engaged with what people are doing right now, as well as what people have been doing in the past. And when I say people, I mean poets. And I feel that for me, one of, the most important messages that I give to my MFA students is that they have to keep reading poetry and keep apprised of what's happening with poetry, now and in the past. And they should especially pay attention to poetry that at first doesn't grab them, because we each have poetry that we probably gravitate toward. For example, I will always love a narrative, meditative type of poem. I just will. But for that reason, I think that it is especially important that I read poets who are very engaged with language as music in itself, or doing something that is form-based. Because all of that is going to help me to expand not just my taste, but my own work. So, I am really grateful to be living in this poetry time. And, look what Zoom has done. I was in a reading a couple of weeks ago that was East Coast, West Coast poets together reading. I'll be reading at a festival in England, in August. So I just feel that it's a wonderful time to be a poet, and it's a joy.
Good. Some real magic always does come from gathering together and sharing our own talents and inspiration. So thank you. I think we got a slice of that today, being here together. So thank you, Suzanne, again. Thank you to the Chelsea and everyone there who joined us. It was so wonderful to partner with you today. We're so pleased at the Hudson Valley Writers Center to be able to offer programming like this, and just so grateful that we were able to spend the afternoon together. Hope we're able to do it again. Thank you, and have a wonderful rest of your week.
Thank you so much.